RTX 2060. NVIDIA launched this card in January 2019 as the entry point into its then-new Turing architecture, which introduced real-time ray tracing and AI-powered upscaling to consumer hardware for the first time. The 2060 came with 6 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory and 1,920 CUDA cores, making it capable of playing most games at 1080p with strong performance. It was not the cheapest card on the market, but it offered a meaningful leap over the older Pascal generation cards it replaced. Many buyers treated it as a gateway into features that previously only existed in professional workstations. The RTX 2060 Super. Released in July 2019, the Super variant arrived just months after the original and offered a noticeable bump in performance without a dramatic increase in price. NVIDIA added more CUDA cores, bringing the count to 2,176 and widened the memory bus slightly. The result was a card that performed closer to the 2070 than the standard 2060, which created some awkwardness in NVIDIA's own lineup at the time. For buyers who had waited a few months before purchasing, the Super made the decision considerably easier. RTX 2070. This card targeted the upper middle of the market when it launched alongside the rest of the Turing lineup in late 2018. With 2,304 CUDA cores and 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory, it handled 1,440p gaming with comfort and even made a reasonable case for entry-level 4K in less demanding titles. It was positioned as the sweet spot card for enthusiasts who wanted a serious GPU without spending flagship money. The 2070 also introduced a second variant of the Turing die, sitting between the entry-level and high-end chips. The RTX 2070 Super, another July 2019 release, the 2070 Super effectively replaced the standard 2070 while pushing closer to 2080 performance. NVIDIA increased the core count to 2,560 and kept the same 8GB memory configuration, but improved the memory bandwidth enough to feel meaningful in real workloads. Many reviewers at the time considered this one of the strongest value cards in the lineup, sitting at a price that felt justifiable given what it delivered. It was the kind of release that made the non-super version feel like a placeholder. The RTX 2080. Launched in September 2018, the 2080 was positioned as the high-end consumer option below the flagship 2080 Ti. It carried 2,944 CUDA cores and 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory, and it performed well at both 1,440p and 4K. The card was powerful, but its pricing drew criticism at launch, as many felt the performance gap over the previous generation did not justify the cost increase. Ray tracing support, while technically present, was still in its early days and came with significant performance trade-offs in the handful of titles that supported it. The RTX 2080 Super. Arriving in July 2019 alongside the other supercards, the 2080 Super closed much of the gap between itself and the 2080 Ti, at least in traditional rasterization workloads. NVIDIA increased the core count to 3,072 and pushed the memory speed higher than the standard 2080. It was a refined version of an already capable card, and it landed at a slightly better price than the original 2080 had at launch. By this point in the Turing generation, the Super refreshes had quietly reorganized the entire mid-to-high tier of the lineup, the RTX 2080 Ti. This was the undisputed flagship of the Turing generation and, at the time of its launch in September 2018, the fastest consumer graphics card ever made. It used a full implementation of the TU-102 die with 4,352 CUDA cores and 11 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory on a 352-bit bus. The 2080 Ti was built for 4K gaming at high settings and made a genuine attempt at pushing ray tracing into playable territory, though that still required significant compromise in resolution or detail. Its price was extraordinary, often exceeding $1,000, and it remained largely untouchable at the top of the desktop market until the next generation arrived. The RTX 3050. NVIDIA released this card in January 2022 as the most affordable entry point into the Ampere generation on desktop. It came with 2,560 CUDA cores and 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory, targeting users who wanted a budget-friendly option capable of running games at 1080p without demanding too much from a power supply or wallet. Performance was modest compared to the rest of the Ampere lineup, but it brought DLSS support and Ampere's efficiency improvements to a price tier that had previously been left behind. It was a card for first-time builders and anyone upgrading from a much older generation, the RTX 3060. NVIDIA released this card in February 2021 as part of the Ampere generation, which brought substantial efficiency and performance improvements over Turing. The 3060 featured 12 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory, which was a surprising amount for a mid-range card and exceeded even some higher-tier GPUs in the lineup. The core count sat at 3,584 and performance at 1080p and 1440p was strong. It launched during a period of severe GPU shortages, which meant many buyers paid well above the suggested retail price. NVIDIA also introduced an early attempt at a mining limiter, which was later bypassed. The RTX 3060 Ti released a few months before the standard 3060 in December 2020. The Ti variant offered meaningfully better performance than its sibling despite having less memory at 8 gigabytes. The 3060 Ti carried 4,864 CUDA cores and consistently traded blows with the previous generation's RTX 2080 Super at a fraction of the price. It became one of the most praised cards of the Ampere generation because the performance per dollar was exceptional, at least at launch, before market conditions inflated prices across the board. Many considered it the true value champion of 2021. The RTX 3070. This was NVIDIA's attempt to bring near-flagship performance to a broader audience, launching in October 2020 at a suggested price of $500, with 5,888 CUDA cores and 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory. The 3070 matched or exceeded the RTX 2080 Ti in most benchmarks, which was a striking claim that held up under testing. It was a compelling card that demonstrated just how far the Ampere architecture had pushed performance per watt compared to Turing. Supply constraints made it nearly impossible to purchase at the intended price for months after launch. The RTX 3070 Ti released in June 2021. The Ti version added more CUDA cores, bringing the total to 6,144, and switched the memory type to the faster GDDR6X standard. The performance difference over the standard 3070 was modest, and the price gap was real enough that many buyers felt the value proposition was softer than NVIDIA's other T variants. Still, for anyone who wanted the extra headroom without stepping up to the 3080, it served its purpose. It also helped NVIDIA fill a gap in a lineup that had become somewhat crowded in the RTX 3080. This was widely regarded as the most impactful card of the Ampere generation and possibly one of the most significant consumer GPU releases in years. Launching in September 2020, the 3080 delivered performance that surpassed the RTX 2080 Ti by a meaningful margin, with 8,704 CUDA cores and initially 10 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory, later followed by a 12 gigabyte variant. The card was fast enough to make 4K gaming feel achievable without constant compromise, and NVIDIA's second-generation Tensor cores made DLSS a much more refined experience than it had been on Turing. Demand was overwhelming and stock sold out within seconds of going live almost everywhere. The RTX 3080 Ti released in June 2021. The 3080 Ti positioned itself just below the flagship 3090 with 10,240 CUDA cores and 12 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory. Performance was close enough to the 3090 in gaming scenarios that the gap was difficult to justify for most users unless they needed more VRAM for professional workloads. NVIDIA had previously used the Ti suffix to describe cards that fell clearly beneath the flagship, but the 3080 Ti blurred that line considerably. It was a high-end option for buyers who wanted nearly the best without the premium attached to the 3090. The RTX 3090. This card sat at the very top of the Ampere consumer lineup and came loaded with 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory, making it relevant not just for gaming but for creative professionals doing video editing, 3D rendering, and machine learning at a scale that would otherwise require a workstation GPU. With 10,496 CUDA cores and a massive die, not primarily a gaming card, even though it performed excellently in that role. NVIDIA priced it accordingly, and most gaming-focused buyers found little reason to choose it over the far less expensive 3080. It existed in a category of its own. The RTX 3090 Ti. Arriving in late March 2022, the 3090 Ti was the last major release of the Ampere desktop lineup and pushed the architecture as far as it could go. It used a fully unlocked GA102 die with 10,752 CUDA cores and the fastest GDDR6X memory available at that point. Power consumption was enormous, requiring up to 450 watts under load, which demanded robust cooling and a capable power supply. RTX 4060. NVIDIA launched this card in June 2023 as the entry-level representative of the Ada Lovelace generation, which introduced the fourth iteration of Tensor cores and a heavily improved version of DLSS. Now at version 3 with frame generation support, came with 8 GB of GDDR6 memory and 3072 CUDA cores, and while raw performance over the 3060 was not dramatic, the efficiency improvements were real. Frame generation allowed the card to produce significantly higher frame rates in supported titles by using AI to insert generated frames between rendered ones. Critics noted the narrow 128-bit memory bus as a limitation, but the card still performed well at 1080p for its price range. RTX 4060 Ti. This card arrived in May 2023 with 4,352 CUDA cores and 8 GB of GDDR6 memory at launch, followed by a 16 GB variant later that year. Performance was solid at 1080p and acceptable at 1440p, but reception was mixed because the gains over the previous generation's 3060 Ti were modest, especially in traditional rasterization. The card leaned heavily on DLSS3 to differentiate itself, and for users playing in supported titles, that gap became more substantial. The 16 GB version addressed memory capacity concerns but did not change the underlying performance profile by a meaningful amount. RTX 4070. Released in April 2023, the 4070 offered a strong step up from the Ti variants below it, while landing at a price that was more palatable than the higher-end cards in the Ada lineup. It carried 5,888 CUDA cores and 12 GB of GDDR6X memory and delivered excellent 1,440 ABID performance, with DLSS3 adding headroom in compatible titles. Efficiency was one of the Ada generation's most talked about improvements and illustrated that clearly, drawing significantly less power than a 3080 while offering comparable or better performance in many scenarios. RTX 4070 Super. NVIDIA released this card in January 2024 as part of a mid-generation Super refresh that restructured the Ada lineup. 7,168 CUDA cores to a price point that had previously housed the standard, making the older model redundant. The increase in shaders and a wider memory configuration made it a noticeably stronger card, and reviewers generally regarded it as one of the best value propositions in the entire lineup. It landed at a moment when consumers had grown critical of what they saw as incremental upgrades, and the Super models were NVIDIA's direct response to that sentiment. RTX 4070 Ti. This card launched in January 2023 and was initially positioned as a high-performance option for 1440p and capable 4K gaming. It used 7,680 CUDA cores paired with 12 GB of GDDR6X memory, and it performed well in both traditional and DLSS accelerated workloads. However, enthusiasm was tempered somewhat by its price relative to what had come before. Some noted that it was effectively a renamed version of a card NVIDIA had quietly shelved before launch under a different name, which colored the conversation around its value at release. RTX 4070 Ti Super, part of the same January 2024 Superwave, the 4070 Ti Super arrived with 8,448 CUDA cores and a significant upgrade to 16 GB of GDDR6X memory. The jump in VRAM was meaningful because it addressed a recurring criticism of the Ada lineup, where memory capacity at the upper mid-tier had seemed conservative given what competing products offered. Performance placed it comfortably between the standard and the 4080, which made it an appealing option for buyers who wanted strong 4K capability without the steep premium of the flagship tier. RTX 4080. Released in November 2022, the 4080 arrived under some controversy because NVIDIA had originally announced two cards under the 4080 name, one of which was later relaunched separately. The version that shipped used the AD103 die with 9,728 CUDA cores and 16 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory. Performance was strong and efficiency was excellent, but the price drew immediate criticism, sitting well above what many considered reasonable for a non-flagship card. It was fast enough to handle 4K gaming with ease and excelled when DLSS 3 was available, but the value discussion never fully settled in its favor during its time on sale. RTX 4080 Super. Arriving in January 2024 alongside the other Super variants, the 4080 Super filled the gap between the standard 4080 and the 4090 with a modest increase in core count, reaching 10,240 while retaining the same 16GB memory configuration. It launched at a slightly lower price than the original 4080 had, which helped soften the perception of Ada's pricing at the high end. Performance improvements over the base 4080 were real but not dramatic in isolation, though the price correction made it feel like a more appropriate card for the tier it occupied. RTX 4090. This is the flagship of the Ada Lovelace generation and, at the time of its release in October 2022, the fastest consumer GPU ever produced. It used the full AD102 die with 16,384 CUDA cores and 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory on a 384-bit bus, drawing up to 450 watts under load. Performance at 4K was in a category by itself, often delivering frame rates that competing and previous generation cards simply could not match. Content creators, AI researchers, and professionals also adopted it in significant numbers because the combination of raw compute and VRAM made it useful far beyond gaming. Its price reflected all of that, and it made no attempt to be accessible. The RTX 5060. NVIDIA positioned this card as the entry-level gateway into the Blackwell generation, targeting the largest segment of the PC gaming market that plays primarily at 1080p. It brought 5th-generation Tensor cores and DLSS 4 support, including multi-frame generation, to a budget-friendly price point, which was the most significant selling point for buyers who had never experienced AI-assisted frame rendering before. Raw rasterization performance was a step above, but the bigger story was efficiency, as Blackwell's architectural improvements allowed the card to do more with considerably less power than its predecessors at the same tier. RTX 5060 Ti. Sitting just above the base 5060, the 5060 Ti offered more CUDA cores and improved memory bandwidth for users who wanted better 1440p capability without moving into the mid to high tier of the Blackwell lineup. The Ti designation brought a meaningful enough performance difference to justify its place in the stack, and DLSS 4 helped it punch above its hardware weight in supported titles. It followed the same pattern that Ti cards had established across previous generations, giving buyers a clear and logical step up from the base model at a moderate price increase. RTX 5070. NVIDIA announced this card as part of the Blackwell consumer generation in early 2025, representing the new mid to high tier entry point. It brought the 5th generation of Tensor cores and an improved version of DLSS, along with architectural refinements aimed at both performance and power efficiency. Was positioned as a capable 4K card for users who did not want to spend flagship prices, and early testing suggested strong results in titles with DLSS 4 multi-frame generation support, which could multiply rendered frames using AI assistance. It continued NVIDIA's approach of leaning on AI-enhanced rendering as a defining characteristic of the generation. RTX 5070 Ti. Sitting above the standard 5070 in the Blackwell lineup, the 5070 Ti carried more cores and a higher memory bandwidth, targeting enthusiast buyers who wanted strong 4K performance with more headroom than the base model could offer. The Ti designation returned here to its more traditional role of marking a meaningful step up, rather than a near-flagship card. NVIDIA placed it at a price designed to attract buyers moving up from the previous generation's upper mid-tier, and it offered a compelling case for those whose workloads or gaming preferences demanded more than could comfortably provide. RTX. This card occupied the second highest position in the Blackwell consumer stack and delivered performance that placed it comfortably in 4K territory with significant headroom. With a large core configuration and fast memory, the 5080 was built for users who wanted a near-flagship experience without committing to the cost and power demands of the top-tier card. Efficiency improvements in Blackwell were notable here, as the 5080 managed to deliver considerable performance gains over its Ada predecessor while maintaining a more measured power draw. It became a natural choice for users upgrading from the RTX 3080 or 4080 generation. RTX 5090. This is the flagship of the Blackwell generation and the most powerful consumer graphics card NVIDIA had produced at the time of its release. It featured an enormous core count paired with 32 gigabytes of GDDR7 memory, which set a new standard for consumer VRAM capacity. The generational leap in raw performance was significant, and multi-frame generation in DLSS 4 allowed it to reach frame rates and supported titles that had not been seen before on consumer hardware. Power consumption was high even by flagship standards, requiring a robust power delivery setup.